The Pittsburgh Steelers were given some not so great odds from Vegas. I'll tell you why they're going to beat them here in the 2023 season here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And we're going to deal with a little bit of FanDuel because we're going to use their odds to talk about what I'm talking about. First of all, happy through the weekend, everybody. Hopefully everyone had a great weekend and everything out there. Wanted to talk about a few things here. So when we talk about odds and stuff, and sometimes you'll hear me talk about FanDuel. I'm going to use FanDuel's numbers in a bit. Oftentimes we're talking about specific games, but they also do their future bets and their future prospects and how many wins is this team going to have? How many? Where are they going to finish in their division and things like that? And those came out recently, and they had some interesting numbers. In particular, how the Steelers will just do on the season wise. Giving out their numbers for the AFC North. FanDuel, along with other betting websites in Vegas, they weren't the only one. They had the Steelers finishing fourth according to their odds. They said the Bengals had the best chance of winning the division at plus 130. The Ravens, the second best at plus 250. The Browns, the third best at plus 390. And the Steelers, the fourth best at 470, basically putting them in fourth place in their division. Now, never mind you the fact that the Steelers have literally never finished in fourth place in the AFC North since the division started in 2002. But you also can go all the way back to 1988 for the last time the Steelers finished last in any division that they were in. That was back when it was the AFC Central. That was back when I wasn't even alive. And it's kind of hard for me to look at that and think, are they really going to finish last in their division this year? Look, I get that the Bengals are talented. I get that the Ravens are talented. I get that the Browns have talent on their roster as well. But so do the Steelers. And again, I look at the Bengals and I say, yeah, that's a team that's going to be a Super Bowl contender in 2023. But the Ravens, they got some work to do. Browns have a lot of work to do. Remember, the Browns, they got smoked by the Steelers last year. And in fact, when you go through the Steelers' wins, no other team lost by more points to the Steelers than the Cleveland Browns last year in the season finale. And this is a year where they didn't really have a huge draft class because they traded all the way their draft picks for Deshaun Watson. So I look at that and I say, listen, I get the Bengals. The Bengals are the Bengals right now. They got the talent. They're in their window. And I certainly think they can be there. I think the Steelers can take them, but I also think that that it's very reasonable to put them first. And I even get the Ravens with second because it's Lamar Jackson's system and they got a new offensive coordinator and there's some hope there and everything. But the Browns, I don't know about that. But it's not just those odds. It's a lot of different things. Well, when we go through different sets of odds out here, there were a few other futures that I wanted to pull up from FanDuel that you can go get there. And these are things that you can bet on right now. So if you go through those AFC North odds, and this of course is for the winner. So who is most likely to win? If you wanted to put money down and you think the Steelers are going to win the division, that's plus 470. If you put down $100, that's $470 in your pocket. But let's look at some other things that they placed here. The win total was set at 8.5 wins, which means you bet over or under that. And it actually, FanDuel had the Steelers favored to get more wins than 8.5, which means 9 wins, which means a winning season, which is what the Steelers do most of the time. Not even most of the time. They haven't had the only time that they've had a non-winning season was when they had 16 games and it resulted in just being 8-8. but they've had nine since they've opened up to 17 games. They've had 9 wins, and I think it's very reasonable to project them to be there again this year. But also, looking at their playoff odds, this is where it's kind of interesting because it has the Steelers. Yeah, they'll get over 8.5 wins, but FanDuel also has the Steelers not making the playoffs, with it being minus 160 for them not making the playoffs. You wanted to put bet there, and plus 128 for if they did want to make the playoffs. And for those who might not be familiar with gambling terms, minus 160 means you have to bet $100 to get. You have to bet $160 to get $100 back on a bet. If you bet on that, plus 128 means that's how much money you would get if you bet $100 on that. So I'm not a gambling expert, but I know a little bit of the basic stuff there. And listen, I get it. The AFC is stacked. And I think that that's where a lot of this is coming from. You got Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs back. You got Josh Allen and the Bills back. You got Joe Burrow and the Bengals back. You got you got the Chargers back with Justin Herbert. You got Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars. They took a step up last year. You got them back. Lamar Jackson's back. Tua Tagovailoa and the Dolphins have loaded up this year. I get it. Those were all the playoff teams last year. But again, the Steelers were right behind those teams last year with all the things they had going against them. Not to mention, TJ Watt being out for 2 months, but just having a rookie quarterback with an offensive line that was trying to figure out what they were doing all at the same time. I'm sorry, but if you look at the Steelers offense from last year and look at it this year and just the talent, the experience, I have a hard time seeing it being a lot worse this year. I have a hard time seeing it not being better this year. And you look at the defense, the biggest changes was Cam Sutton's out and Patrick Peterson's in. Terrell Edmonds is replaced by KZ, and KZ was there last year, but he was replaced by Keanu Neal. Devin Bush and Miles Jack are basically replaced by Landon Roberts and Cole Holcomb. But the key pieces of the defense are there. Minkah Fitzpatrick, TJ Watt, Cam Hayward. And then even guys like Larry Ogunjobi, they're going to be healthy this year. Remember, Larry Ogunjobi came into the Steelers camp last year. He couldn't practice at first because he was dealing with an injury that was the reason why the Steelers got him in the first place, because he couldn't pass his physical from what the Bears signed him. So I look around the board here. The Steelers not making the playoffs, being that, man, I don't know. I'm putting that bet down. I think the Steelers make the playoffs. Because as much as everyone's just banking on, well, these teams with these quarterbacks that have these big names and produce well in fantasy football, they're just going to be as good as they were last year. I'm not sold on that. The Chargers are the team that always folds from high predictions. The Jaguars, maybe they'll still be up in there because the AFC South is just so bad. But I don't think it's a given that the Chargers are going to be all that much better than the Steelers, that the Ravens are going to be all that much better than the Steelers, or the Dolphins are going to be all that much better than the Steelers. I mean, heck, when the Dolphins played the Steelers last year and they didn't even have TJ Watt, it took Kenny Pickett throwing 3 interceptions in the game, 2 in the fourth quarter on potential game-winning drives for them to hold on. And I think we saw Kenny Pickett last year in the second half of last season wasn't that same Kenny Pickett anymore. And I want to get more on Kenny Pickett later because, one, he got married. Congratulations to him. But I think this all plays a big factor in how the Steelers are going to look this season. And it all kind of factors into a conversation I had with another Locked On host just this past weekend on a show that, I'll tell you about in just a minute here. Because I get arguments against the Steelers doing really well this year. You've heard me on the show. I don't think they're winning a Super Bowl. I don't think they're getting to a Super Bowl. I think that if they get to the AFC Championship game, that is you made it way over the hill. I think if they get to an AFC divisional round game, that is a mission accomplished. They've taken the step up this year. Next year, get ready for when I think they start making real swings. But again, I think that when we're looking at what the Steelers could be this upcoming season and where they're coming from just being, I think it's realistic to expect them to overperform some of these odds that they're being given in Vegas. We'll talk about that More here on the Locked On Steelers podcast in the upcoming segments. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us as we continue these discussions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel Sportsbook. And of course, FanDuel Sportsbook is the number one sportsbook in America where you can get these very odds that we're talking about here right now. Now, while you could bet on NFL futures, baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. And right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet, which gives you up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win when you try it on FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up to get that opportunity. So get on it right now. You can make bets on all of Major League Baseball and make your NFL future bets if you think you can make some money off of some of the odds I just listed about you on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets when you join FanDuel today by going to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball trademarks used with permission. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. I wanted to revisit a point I was just making there about a show that I was on. So for those who don't know, if you want to get more of what I do, first go check out the North Shore Drive podcast, Monday, Wednesday, Friday show I do at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where I do all my writing. And I do that with a lot of our Steelers beat writers there, Ray Fittipaldo, Brian Batko. We would do it. And I also talk some Penguins and Pirates and all that other stuff. But you can also check me on Fridays on the Locked On NFL podcast, where I normally host with your boy Q, who's the host of Locked On Raiders. He was on vacation. We hosted with Lauren Cox of Locked On Bears. And during our conversation, our lead-in point was we were ranking the non-playoff teams from last year in 2022 and the likelihood that they would make the playoffs in 2023. Now, you know your boy. I was picking the Steelers at number 1 the whole way. Lauren put them at number 4, and he thought that the Cleveland Browns and a few other teams had some better odds. And I get the Jets. You know, they added Aaron Rodgers. They're a young team with a lot of good prospects and talent on it. I get the Jets being one team that you could say, I'm like, okay, I can see that there with the addition of a future Hall of Fame quarterback. But I don't get the Browns. And I get that there's some skepticism about like, oh, well, are the Steelers even the best team, right now going into that? But here's what I say to that. They were last year of the non-playoff teams. They were the best team. They were a tiebreaker away from being in there. In fact, go look at the non-playoff teams from last year. They were tied with the Lions for having the best record of teams that didn't make the playoffs. And again, this was a year that I think that on most teams, they would have catered or cratered. They would have fallen out of the sky like a meteor. They lost their best player in the first game of the season for 2 months. He didn't come back until after the bye week. TJ Watt, and we know how important TJ Watt is for the Pittsburgh Steelers. We've seen it over the years. When he's on the field, they're winning. When he's not on the field, they're losing. They were 1-6 without him last year? And they were 8-2 with him? And go back over the past few years when he's like missed a game here, missed a game there for odds and ends injuries. He hasn't missed a whole bunch of games. Just last year was the first time he missed that much significant time. But again, we're looking at a team that was 9-8 last year. And again, with a rookie quarterback and a developing offensive line, an offense that was trying to figure out what its identity was. One thing we talked to Najee Harris about, and we've talked to all of them about, there's no question about what the identity is of this team anymore. They know who they want to be. They know who they're going to be. They know they're going to be physical. They know they're going to pound you with the run game. They know that, and Kenny Pickett, I think, is going to have a much better idea of how he's going to make plays. And I want to get more on Kenny Pickett later. But still focusing on just the overall composition of the Steelers in 2023, it's better than it was in 2022 when they finished 9-8. And for those who might say, oh, well, it's the schedule, because that was one of Lauren's points, was like, hey, the Steelers, they had that stretch down the second half of the season where they faced a lot of favorable opponents. And I agree, some of those teams weren't all that. They faced the Colts, they faced the Falcons, they faced the Panthers, they faced the Raiders, they faced the Ravens and the Browns. And though the Ravens did make the playoffs, so I guess that they're not there. But the Browns, who are supposed to be, this team that everyone's thinking is going to be better. But last year they had Deshaun Watson. They still had Deshaun Watson in that last game of the season, and Kenny Pickett still outscored them 28-14. But I hear you. Okay, the last stretch there: Colts, Falcons, Panthers, Raiders. Those 4 teams specifically, and you throw in the Ravens and the and the Browns there. Okay, those 4 teams, I get you. But who's on the schedule for the Steelers in 2023? I'm sorry, the Raiders are your Week 3 team. You got the Houston Texans, who are even in a worse situation than that. They have the Rams, who are like in the middle of fallout to rebuild mode. They've got an Aaron Rodgers-less Packers. They've got the Cardinals. Oh, the Colts, one of the teams we just mentioned. A Patriots team that I think is going to be looking for its identity in the AFC East. Oh, and by the way, the Browns team, who I guess they don't get credit for beating last year. So, I mean, they're going to have plenty of opportunities to beat up on these teams. And again, they're going to be a better roster in 2023. They've invested in their offensive line, not just Broderick Jones, because, again, we talked about that with Jim Wexell last week. There's a chance that Broderick Jones doesn't start if Dan Moore Jr. takes a real big step up in camp, and, who knows if that's going to happen. But even with just Isaac Seumalo added to this offensive line, and the group knowing each other and playing together and having its identity and knowing how to play as a unit, that's going to be a boost to them. And it's going to be a boost to Kenny Pickett. It's going to be a boost to Najee Harris, who also, by the way, started the year hurt. And if Kenny Pickett's getting a boost, guess who's also getting a boost? Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth. And they're getting Allen Robinson. Calvin Austin's actually going to be able to play. And they added that Darnell Washington guy. I'm sorry, but what part of the Steelers is going to be worse this year? Unless there's some catastrophic injuries. And injuries, they're unpredictable. If they happen, that throws everything into whack. When that happens, I'm like, okay, all bets are off. That's a whole different story. But again, I match it up with their opponents this year. And again, I look at the AFC and I say, okay, some of those teams are really tough. And let's even go back and look at, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm pulling up the images of the different rankings and stuff. The Chiefs are going to be the Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes, they might win 2-3 more Super Bowls in the next 4 years because they are that good. But the Bills, I don't know, man. I think the Bills is the time of this core of a Josh Allen-led Bills, I think, is running out of time to be in its window. Not that Josh Allen's running out of time in his window, but we've seen how eras around quarterbacks can end and have to take a restart. Look at the Steelers in the late 2000s into the early 2010s. That crew that won the Super Bowl and went to another one, they ran their course around like 2011. And then 2012 and 2013, the Steelers were kind of in a rebuild mode. And then 2014, bang, they started the new era. And 2019, that was right around the time when that era came to an end, and we started to see the rebuild starting to happen again. But I think the Bills might be in that part of the cycle. I don't think the Bengals are there yet. I think they're about 2 years away from maybe being in that, if they don't hit on some more draft picks and they have to pay Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase super money, which very well could happen because both those guys are fantastic players. But the Jaguars, we got to see them be consistent. They finished with the same record as the Steelers. They just played in the AFC South. The Chargers, they gave the craziest comeback we've seen in playoffs to the Jaguars. The Ravens are always going to be the thorn in the Steelers' side, and vice versa. That they're rivals for a great reason. The Dolphins could legitimately be better. I think Tua's going to be a better quarterback. They added Jalen Ramsey. We'll see what happens with the Tyreek Hill situation. Who knows? And then, of course, you got the Jets with Aaron Rodgers. So I get it. There's talent in the AFC. But again, the Steelers have talent too. They beat the Bengals last year. They beat the Ravens last year in their house. They were able to finish strong, winning 6 out of their last 7. And they only lost to the Bengals by a single possession later that year. I say all this to say, the odds makers, I get what they're doing. But if I'm looking at these odds, pulling these back up again from FanDuel, AFC North odds, I wouldn't take the odds for the Steelers to win the division because, again, I still think that the Bengals do that. But if there was a way to get an odds for who's not going to finish last, I would take that. Steelers wins odds, they're getting more than 8 wins. They're not finishing with a losing record. Steelers playoff odds, I'm taking the yes. And it's not like you get a whole bunch of extra money for betting yes there with a plus 128, but I think that they're going to be in a position if they were barely edged out last year with all the things that went against them and a harder schedule when you had to play like the Eagles and the Bills on your schedule in back-to-back weeks, again with a rookie quarterback and again without TJ Watt and again with an offensive line that was still figuring it out and an offense in general that was figuring out who the heck they were. Again, I just look at all those odds and I think all those things, I'd be betting on the Steelers instead of betting against them. And another part of that is Kenny Pickett himself, who again got married this weekend. Congratulations to him. I have a few thoughts on Kenny Pickett that I'm going to expand upon more in the week, but I want to get you my thoughts on them right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. I want to continue my point here because I think one of the biggest points about why odds makers and people in general are down about the Steelers is Kenny Pickett, because they look at those raw stat numbers and they see, well, he threw 9 interceptions last year. He only threw 7 touchdowns. I mean, that's not really good for a rookie quarterback. And listen, I get that. Okay, box score, yeah, that was not great. And if I was looking at that and just taking a bird's eye view of the situation, I might skim over that and say, yeah, you know what? Let's not bet on these guys to make a huge rise this year because of that. But that's not what we do here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We don't do bird's eye views of the Pittsburgh Steelers. We're in the locker rooms. I've been in the locker rooms. You've seen me interviewing players, bringing those interviews right here on this show. You've seen me talking about it with other Steelers insiders and sharing our opinions here. We take the deep dives. And with Kenny Pickett, I think that there are a lot of people underestimating, I think, the rise that he can take in 2023. Now, again, he got married over the weekend. Congratulations to him, his new wife, Amy. It's awesome for them. The pictures were adorable and gorgeous. They did a great job with the wedding. All this stuff looked really cool. But even leading up to the wedding itself, Kenny Pickett was like out there throwing passes to Allen Robinson at some camp, working on footwork, working on different specific route combinations and where to hit him and building that repetition, things that he couldn't do last year. Things that he couldn't get in and get on with and build that rapport with any of his receivers, let alone a new one that just got the team, because he was the new guy last year. I had a source close to the team and close to Kenny Pickett, rather, who told me at one point, going back to last year, when Kenny Pickett couldn't practice with the first team because he wasn't running the first team, in order for him to tell me, or excuse me, not tell me, but in order for him to get the reps that he needed to get to feel comfortable to be ready with the first team whenever he was called upon, what Kenny Pickett did was he would come in extra early before practices and go through the mental reps of everything the first team was doing that day. Every play, whether it was a play they knew, a new installed play, go through everything in his head, mental reps, physical reps by himself, just in a room, just banging that on himself. And then he would go out and then run with the second team and do the things that were naturally there, just a part of the mandatory practices that the Steelers were doing. But that was his process back then. to try to get a grasp on what he was about to face because he knew he needed to get some sort of mental reps in there before he was thrown into the fire the way that he was when the Steelers put him in the Jets game. So a guy that was taking all those precautions back then as a rookie and who now has an office that the Steelers have given him in their facility to specifically watch film because he watches film so much to the point that teammates are like, just relaxing and catching their breath after practice. And he's going upstairs working on something with Minkah Fitzpatrick and going over not just what they did or what their opponents did, but what they did in practice a year ago and comparing it to how they're doing in practice now. This man is a student of the game. And it's the same student of the game that made him a great quarterback his last year at Pitt. I covered him at Pitt, and this is why I keep bringing up that I covered him at Pitt. It's not to just name drop and say, oh, yeah, I did that. It's to say I saw him go through his grind. Even when everything wasn't lined up at Pitt, he threw in his 2 years leading up to his final season at Pitt, he threw 13 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. Sorry, Wes Euler, I had to get that one in there. But in his last year, he threw the most touchdowns or scored the most touchdowns in the history of an ACC quarterback. And that's beating the likes of Jameis Winston when he was at Florida State and they won their national championship, and beating the likes of Deshaun Watson when he was with Clemson. And part of it was because the work that he put in to gradually get better all the time. And sometimes it didn't take in 2020. But the year before that, they went on that ACC title run. His receivers dropped passes left and right. Even Jordan Addison, who won the Biletnikoff Award the very next year, there was a consistency issue with the receiver. It happened a lot. Go back and watch those games. If you're a Pitt fan, you remember some of those games. And you were like, oh man, this is rough. In 2021, that was not nearly a problem, and that led to Kenny Pickett's rise there. And I think the Steelers receiving weapons, not just the receivers, they're receiving weapons, will put Kenny Pickett in a position where he doesn't have to worry about something like that. I know some people was going to say, well, what about Deontay Johnson's drops? And yes, he does drop the ball on occasion, just like Justin Jefferson, just like Cooper Kupp, just like Jamar Chase, just like a lot of the big name receivers who actually dropped the ball more than Deontay Johnson did last year. And that's not to say Deontay Johnson doesn't have other things to clean up. He needs to stop running back behind the first down line. He needs to be able to get more yak at times. But he's a great route runner and might be one of the best route runners in the NFL. There's certain stats that say he is the best route runner in the NFL. I'm not going to go that far with him, but he's a talented player, and I think he's ready to break loose for the Steelers. I think George Pickens is kind of the opposite end. He's great at making the big play and securing the catch. He just needs to run better routes to get more open, to create more yards after catch on his end. But then you have Pat Freiermuth, who I think is maybe the most underrated tight end in the NFL. You have Zach Gentry and Darnell Washington as a 1-2 punch up behind him, not to mention Connor Hayward as a utility player who can be a tight end or a fullback or whatever you want him to be. You could just put football player next to his name. He'll play that. And then, you got Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. And Kenny Pickett is working with these guys to get sharper with them in the offseason. Again, I didn't even bring up Allen Robinson, who specifically he was working with just last week leading up to his big wedding in an offseason where he could be like, you know what, I'm good. I'm the franchise quarterback. I'll see these guys in training camp, or I'll do this after my wedding. No, that's just who Kenny Pickett is. And he even talked about it, publicly before. He was like, when he got drafted and he proposed to his girlfriend and everything, his fiance at the time, now his wife, she told him to get back out there. Or I think when the season was over, she said to get back out there and keep working because that's where you want to be. This guy is that determined. And I'm sorry, but a guy who is this determined as Kenny Pickett is, a guy that's putting in the extra work, even doing the mental reps, doing the film study, doing the reps with his players, he is going to be sharper this year. And we were talking about all the other circumstances, just the natural circumstances that I think will be better for the Steelers. Better offensive line play because they've got better players, more experienced offensive line, more experienced players that in the offense. The natural growth of what you'd expect for Kenny Pickett as a second-year player to be better than a first-year player. The same thing for Pat Freiermuth and Najee Harris as third-year players versus second-year players. The fact that TJ Watt is most likely going to not miss 2 months of football this upcoming season. All those things are just the natural part of it. I think the unnatural part of this is Kenny Pickett and the extra work that he does to be a sharper quarterback. And I think it will show this year in 2023. And I'm not saying it's going to show and put him in like MVP conversations, But I'm saying it's going to show, and people are going to be like, whoa, Kenny Pickett, maybe we underestimated him. And there'll be this talk in the middle part of the season where everyone's going to be looking around and saying, well, maybe the Steelers found another one, and who knows? And there'll be some that don't give him his credit. They'll say, oh, they're playing soft teams. They'll make excuses for them because they do that anytime the Steelers start to get good, and they don't want, and people don't acknowledge it. But I think that Kenny Pickett is a guy who will surprise people this year. And that's another big reason why I'm going back to those Vegas odds on FanDuel and everywhere else. Bet on the Steelers to beat those odds. Maybe not win the division. Maybe not, win the AFC or even get to the AFC Championship game. But I think they're making the playoffs. I think they're getting more than 8 wins. Heck, I think they're getting more than 9 wins. I'd be shocked if they got less than, I'm saying it right now, I'll be shocked if they get less than 11 wins this year. And that's not just me making that number up, because I've gone over this and gone over the opponents this year. Again, barring major injuries. Because again, barring major injuries last year, going back over the season, they probably beat 2 or 3 of those teams with TJ Watt that they lost to in the early part, like the Jets, like the Patriots, like the Dolphins. But barring major injury this year, I see a similar type of run where if TJ Watt's there and Minkah Fitzpatrick's there and Cam Hayward's there and Kenny Pickett and Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth, and the offensive line doesn't get utterly destroyed, which that karma could come back around because none of the offensive linemen missed a start last year, and we know how things can turn back around on you. But I look at how this schedule looks at here, and I have it on the screen right in front of me. And if you're watching it on YouTube, I think that the Steelers could get 11 wins this year, reasonably, not overperformingly. I think that Kenny Pickett will overperform his expectations. But I think when he starts to do that and the defense plays well and the offense is sharper as a whole this year, you're going to see a better Steelers team with a better record than 9-8 from last year. And if they're getting 10 wins, yes, that could be a bit of a cluster in the AFC, but I think they get at least 11 wins. And if they get that, they're in the playoffs. And I'll take that bet from FanDuel to get them into the playoffs in 2023. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks again to everyone who checked out the show. Happy Monday to everyone out there. We hope that everyone has a strong week. We got a lot of stuff coming up for you. We got Alan Saunders coming on tomorrow, talking more Pittsburgh Steelers here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. You can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. Also, don't forget, all summer long, we have our campaign to raise money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, who are raising money to find a cure for cystic fibrosis. You could donate by using this QR code that is currently on your screen, or a link that is attached in the podcast description, whether you're on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app. And if you call into our show at 412-223-6644 and leave a voicemail, leave your name, where you're from, so that we can get you on the show and keep your question under a minute. But if you do that and you donate at least $10 to this campaign, you will get your call answered on the air, at least within a week. Most likely, I will get you on in the next show or two to get you in there and put you at the top of the queue. But thanks again to everyone who has donated so far. We're still raising money. We've raised over $1,600 so far. We appreciate everyone who's contributed to that and will contribute to that in the future, because that runs through September. But again, thanks to everyone for checking out the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. I'll be back on your screens and in your ears Tuesday talking more Pittsburgh Steelers.